Good evening. I'll present on a paper on the problems with e-course data that we published in 2019, I think, 2020. So basically, we began with the research question of looking at commercial disputes and try to compare performance among the states. But once we got access to the data, we soon realized that we can't really do that because of the problems with the data. And we were not the first people to find out that there were certain problems. Daksh had already pointed it out. Law Commission of India had also pointed it out. Law Commission, I think, tried to calculate the case caseload across different states, and they could not do it because of lack of data. Daksh said that there's lack of standardization across case types, and you can't really compare one case type that is cases under one case type in one state with cases under the same case type in a different state. So because there were already these problems that existed, we sort of quantified all the extent of the errors in the sample that we had. And we also tried to say where you can use the data and where you cannot use the data, for what purpose you can use and can't use the data. So that is the basic gist of our research. And for our sample, because we were looking at commercial cases initially, so we decided to look at 5 acts, which was Arbitration and Conciliation, Indian Contracts Act, Negotiable Instruments, Specific Relief, and Transfer of Property Act. And we selected 2 districts from each state, one the capital city, and every district when they had a high court bench. And if there was only one high court bench in the state, then the next most populous district. The idea was that we'll get most commercial cases or most commercial activity if we follow this methodology. And for each selected district, we had all court complexes. So I think in the final data set, we covered almost 600 court complexes or something across the country. And the total data set that we had was around 10.2 lakh cases. Now, when we began the study, we realized that just the act tagging in the cases is pretty inconsistent. So we decided to see whether we can check what the accuracy of the act variable tag itself is. So to run a check, we created a separate small data set, which was from the case type, commercial suit case type that we picked for all the districts in the sample. And from that, we just picked 10 random cases for each selected court complexes, and this was 1,308 cases. Now, just remember that there are 2 different data sets that we chose. One was the main data set, which was the bigger one, and the second one was just to check whether the act names that we were relying on to create the first data set, how consistent those variables are, how consistent that particular variable is. And the particular things that we focused on, that I'll focus on in the presentation, would be the distribution of cases. So the year of filing and the geographical coverage of the cases, the tagging of acts and sections, availability of final orders, and date variables. So one thing to keep in mind is that the e-courts project was implemented in phases, right? So I think in 2014 was when the e-committee announced that most of the court complexes have been digitized, at least the infrastructure has reached the digitization. The computers and stuff have reached till 2014. So what we see here is that in our sample, we hardly find any disposed cases, or rather, even the number of cases we see regularly are from 2014 to 15. The legacy data has never been digitized. So we don't see any data that has been disposed of, say, in 2010 or 2011. What we see here are the cases after the court has been digitized. So for instance, every case that we see in 2014 are the cases that have had a hearing since 2014. So any case that was instituted in 2010 and got disposed in 2011 is not there in the data set. And that means that we don't know how many cases were disposed in 2010 in itself, because that data is not available. And this makes it very difficult to compare caseload across years, for instance. Um, and one thing to keep in mind while looking at this is that the pending and disposed tags are as on August 1, 2019. So what we see here are cases that were number of cases that were filed in 2014 for which we have data for are still pending in 2019. So 50,000 cases almost are still pending in 2019 that were filed in 2014. And for the disposed cases, from all the cases that might have been instituted in 2014, only 12,000 cases are there that entered into the system. Everything that got disposed before the courts were digitized are not there in the system. So that's why you see a very weird disposed graph, especially. So even if I look at if we change it to percentage, you'll see that we don't really see any disposed cases percentage for 2010, 11, 12, because these have not been digitized still. Now, I'll move on to the geographical distribution of these cases. One thing that we were looking at 5 acts in this, and the problem with wait. So we were looking at 5. This is just taking a bit of time to update. So we were looking at cases, distribution of cases across case types. So you'll see that a lot of states do not really have cases under specific acts. So Delhi, for instance, although it has the most cases for us, it doesn't really record any acts or cases under Indian Contracts Act or the Transfer of Property Act. And that is a problem throughout in a lot of these states. So, for instance, Karnataka, for instance, does not record any case under specific relief, or Jharkhand, for instance, does not record any cases under Indian Contracts Act. So all of these issues are happening because the tagging of acts is not consistent throughout the court complexes, and a lot of and the way that the system was designed was that NICS designed the system at the top level, right? So the court complexes at the lower level do not have the capacity to even change the acts that have been entered into the system directly. So there's a lot of inconsistency that is there in the system in general. And when we look at, so this is a graph that shows for the 5 acts that we had chosen, how many states have entire acts missing. And the red ones are the worst ones. So say for Karnataka, we are missing cases under Indian Contracts Acts, Specific Relief Act and Transfer of Property Act. So they do not record any cases under these 3 acts in our sample. And Tamil Nadu, for instance, does not record any cases under 4 of the selected acts that we had. Most of the green would be the best case scenario for us, but most of the states here are not green, which is the inconsistency in tagging for acts. Now, because we had so many issues in looking at it from the act side, we looked at the smallest data set sample, which we had queried based on the case types. And when you query on the case types, you see that there are a lot of acts that they tag which are not really commercial in nature, such as Domestic Violence Act, or they even tag procedures as acts. So all of this does not really give you a lot of information about the substantive legislation before the act, or under which the act is filed. And also something like a permanent injunction is not exactly a case, but this will be treated like a case. Or say, for instance, if it's a transfer petition, it will be listed as a transfer petition under the act, but it will not tell you, and it will have a separate number and tag, but it will not tell you to which is the main matter it is linked to. So it will have a separate number, but you can't really link it to the main matter for which the suit is filed. And all of that leads to problems in what cases are and how we track those cases in the system. And for final orders, for which PDFs should be available, we find that 70% almost cases do not have links to the final orders. And this is, and so if we look at, and this does not get better even across the years. So almost 30% is the error rate. And even across geographies, in this graph, anything lighter should be better. Dark red is worse for us. So only 2 or 3 states are around nine. Karnataka, for instance, has 95% cases with orders, but everything else is around 25, 30%, 40%, and quite not really good. The second thing is that a lot of, and this is just the availability of final orders, but there's also a problem with the quality of final orders in itself. A lot of the orders that are uploaded are either not machine readable or in the local language. And that means that it is very difficult for anyone to process those PDFs at scale. The dates is the only column which is actually recorded quite reliably. And we see that only 3 to 4% of the cases are missing these dates. And so so when we look at the data, there are a lot of issues that we have with the data, which is availability, identification of the statutes, statute names and case types are not congruent. The final orders are missing and related matters not being tagged. So the problem, and why we see these issues is that there is a very different kind of record keeping at district courts. So district courts actually maintain a very separate sort of data flow management system that is different from e-courts. And because they have had that system in place before ecourts project was even implemented, these two things are don't really talk to each other. And there's actually replication of work that's going on where the case management at lower courts happens on a different system and the recording happens on the e-courts, and that leads to these kind of inconsistencies. And there's also the problem of what actually constitutes a case. So interlocutor IAs or transfer petitions are actually listed as separate cases, and they are not tagged according with the main case. And it's very difficult to track the exact complexity of a suit with the data that we have. And there's also the lack of integration between the different court management systems. So there's no, you can't really compare say the act list of one district court in Maharashtra with the act list of separate district court in Maharashtra itself. Those two will be two different act lists, and that might lead to, and that leads to standardization issues. So it is not like the data is completely useless. It is just that it is very difficult to compare it across geographies or across times. So state level studies can be conducted if the districts in the state have reliable data, but even that is not the case in the data set that we have. Certain districts are, we expected them to be pretty good, but they were not. And we cannot use the data set, say, for pendency and disposal rates before 2014, because the numbers and the data does not exist, especially for legacy cases, or for studies on substantive laws, because there is difference in what courts tag cases under each substantive law. So I think this is it. This was the slide. So we'll take any questions if you have.